Chapter 1. The Angel's Prophetic Vision. There are few moments in the grim annals of the 31st millennium more profound than when destiny reveals its hand to those who would dare defy it. Above Terra, as the galaxy's greatest civil war reached its crescendo, the Blood Angel's flagship Red Terra cut through the void like a crimson blade against the star-filled darkness. Within its hallowed halls, Sanguinius stood alone in his private sanctum, golden armor gleaming despite the weight of endless war, yet his perfect features were marred by an expression of profound unease. The Angel of Bile had always possessed the gift of foresight, that rare blessing and curse that marked him among his brother Primarchs. But tonight, as the orbital bombardment of Terra thundered far below and the screams of dying mortals echoed through the warp itself, his visions came not as gentle whispers of possibility, but as roaring torrents of absolute certainty. The future unfolded before his mind's eye with crystalline clarity, and what he saw filled even his noble heart with despair. He saw himself standing upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Horus's corrupted flagship, facing the brother who had once been dearer to him than any save the Emperor himself. The War Master stood before him, no longer the charismatic leader who had inspired worlds to compliance, but a thing of shadow and malice, his very presence warping reality around him. The four ruinous powers flowed through Horus like poison through veins, transforming the greatest of the Primarchs into something that should never have existed. Yet in this vision of things to come, Sanguinius did not rage against his fallen brother. He did not weep for what they had lost. Instead, he stood resolute, wings spread wide, accepting the fate that awaited him. The confrontation was brief, terrible, and final. Horus's claws found their mark, tearing through angelic flesh with ease, and Sanguinius fell, his life's blood painting the deck of the ship that had once carried them both to countless victories. But the vision did not end with his death. It continued, stretching across millennia like a wound that would never heal. Sanguinius witnessed the psychic scream that his destruction sent through the warp, a death cry that would echo through the souls of every blood angel who would ever live. He saw his sons in the centuries to come, noble warriors driven to madness by the phantom pain of their Primarch's murder. The Black Rage, they would call it, this terrible curse that transformed the Emperor's finest into howling berserkers who could no longer distinguish past from present. He watched as countless generations of his gene sons painted their armor black and red, marking themselves as the Death Company, before charging into battles they could never survive. Warriors who had served with honor for decades suddenly found themselves lost in visions of their Primarch's final moments, seeing Horus's face in every enemy, feeling the War Master's claws in every wound. They died by the thousands, by the millions, their nobility consumed by an endless cycle of rage and despair. The visions showed him chapter keeps across the galaxy, where his sons struggled with the red thirst, that other curse born of his genetic legacy. Even in the far future, 10,000 years hence, blood angels would fight not only the enemies of mankind, but the beast within themselves. He saw librarians weeping as they chronicled the names of brothers lost to madness, chaplains whose duty it was to guide the afflicted to honorable deaths, and chapter masters who carried the weight of watching their finest warriors consumed by inherited trauma. Yet it was not the suffering of his sons alone that filled Sanguinius with anguish. The vision revealed the broader consequences of his martyrdom, how his noble death would become a symbol that inspired but also trapped the blood angels in cycles of self-destruction. They would fight with unmatched valor, yes, but always shadowed by the knowledge that their genetic heritage was flawed, that they carried within them the seeds of their own damnation. The imperium would honor them, but also fear them, and rightly so. 10 millennia of bloodshed stretched before his prophetic sight like a crimson river, with no end. Battle brothers falling to the black rage on distant worlds whose names he could not pronounce. Death Company Marines charging into impossible odds, seeking the deaths that might free them from their torment. Chaplains reciting the names of the lost, while new brothers joined their ranks, the curse spreading like a plague of honor and madness intertwined. Sanguinius saw himself as he would be remembered, not as the living Primarch who had fought alongside his sons, but as the perfect martyr whose sacrifice had become the foundation of their identity. They would worship his memory while cursing his legacy, love him for his nobility, while hating the inheritance he had left them. His death would define them more completely than his life ever had, transforming the Blood Angels from proud warriors into tragic figures caught between divine inspiration and genetic doom. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon him like a mountain of sorrows. Every Blood Angel who would ever fall to the Black Rage, every brother lost to madness, every promising warrior consumed by inherited fury. All of this suffering could be traced back to a single moment aboard the vengeful spirit. His death, noble though it might be, would purchase nothing save 10,000 years of anguish for his sons. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Sanguinius felt something else stirring within his perfect psyche. A connection, thin as spider's silk, but strong as adamantium, reached out across the void to touch the minds of his sons fighting on Terra's surface far below. Blood Angels died by the dozen in the siege lines, their gene seed crying out as their bodies were broken by traitor weapons. Yet in their final moments, they thought not of their own pain, but of their Primarch, and their love for him blazed like stars in the darkness of the warp. Through this connection, Sanguinius felt their devotion, their absolute faith in his righteousness and nobility. They would die for him gladly, without question, believing that their sacrifice served a greater purpose. But what if that purpose could be achieved without their endless suffering? What if the future could be changed, not through noble martyrdom, but through the kind of decisive action that heroes take when all other paths lead to damnation? The angel of Baal straightened his shoulders and spread his wings, feeling the weight of prophecy settle upon him like armor forged from destiny itself. He had seen the future that awaited if he followed the path of expected heroism, and found it wanting. His sons deserved better than 10 millennia of madness born from inherited trauma. The Imperium deserved better than the slow stagnation that would come from the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne. For the first time in his existence, Sanguinius contemplated not just noble death, but the far more difficult path of determined survival. The vision had shown him what martyrdom would cost, and the price was too high. His perfect features hardened with resolve as he made a choice that would reshape the galaxy itself. He would go to the vengeful spirit, not to die beautifully for the inspiration of ages, but to live and fight and kill, whatever the cost to his own soul. The future was not set in stone, merely written in the blood of prophecy. And blood, even the blood of destiny itself, could be spilled and rewritten by those with the will to defy fate itself. Sanguinius, the angel of Baal, had seen tomorrow's suffering and found it unacceptable. Now he would teach the galaxy that even prophecy could be broken by those who refuse to accept that some prices were too terrible to pay. The Red Terra continued its approach toward the final battle, but the Primarch who stood within it was no longer the same being who had entered this meditation. Sanguinius had looked into the abyss of the future and chosen to fight it, not with noble acceptance, but with the fury of an angel who would not allow his sons to inherit damnation. The die was cast, and destiny itself would learn that some noble hearts burn too brightly to be extinguished by fate. Chapter 2. The broken chains of destiny. The moment of translation tore through reality like a blade cutting silk. Above Terra's ravaged surface, the Emperor's most elite forces gathered upon the bridge of the Red Terra, their golden forms standing resolute against the backdrop of orbital fire. Yet even among these champions of mankind, it was Sanguinius who commanded attention, his perfect features set in an expression that spoke not of noble resignation, but of terrible purpose. The angel's wings spread wide as psychic energies built around the strike force, reality itself bending to accommodate the Emperor's will. Beside him, Rogel Dawn checked his weapons with the methodical precision that had made the Imperial Fist's legends across 1,000 battlefields. The Praetorian of Terra spoke no words of encouragement or strategy, for all knew their purpose. The vengeful spirit hung in the void like a wound against the stars, its corrupted hull pulsing with energies that should never have existed. Within that ship waited the War Master, the greatest of the Emperor's sons turned against his father, and with him the fate of humanity itself. The Emperor stood at the center of the teleportation array, his golden armor blazing with power that hurt to perceive directly. Even his own sons found it difficult to look upon him in this moment, for the master of mankind had cast aside all pretense of mortality. He was no longer merely the Emperor, but something far more terrible and magnificent, a being whose very presence caused reality to shiver with potential. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of stars dying and being born. "My sons," the Emperor said, his words echoing through dimensions that had no names. "We go now to end what should never have begun. Horus has chosen his path, and we must choose ours. Whatever we find aboard that ship, remember that we fight not for victory alone, but for the soul of humanity itself." Sanguinius felt the familiar sensation of the warp opening around them, but this time something was different. The visions from his meditation had changed him in ways both subtle and profound, sharpening abilities he had always possessed, but never fully understood. As the teleportation effect took hold, scattering the assault force across the vast bulk of the vengeful spirit, Sanguinius found himself seeing not just where he was, but where he needed to be. The angel materialized in a corridor deep within the ship's bowels, but unlike his companions who would struggle to navigate the twisted passageways, Sanguinius moved with supernatural certainty. His precognitive abilities, heightened by his glimpse into futures yet to come, guided his steps through routes that had not yet been chosen. He was no longer following destiny, but rewriting it with each decision, each turn through the corrupted halls of his fallen brother's flagship. The first sons of Horus he encountered died before they could register his presence. These were not the noble warriors who had once fought beside him during the Great Crusade, but things of shadow and malice, their gene seed twisted by exposure to the warp's darkest truths. Yet as Sanguinius's blade carved through their ranks with unprecedented savagery, he remembered them as they had been, brothers in service to a dream that had died somewhere between the stars. He recalled Hasta Sejanus, Horus's beloved equerry, whose wit had brightened even the darkest campaigns. The warrior who fell beneath Sanguinius's sword bore Sejanus's face, but corrupted beyond recognition, his eyes pools of malevolent fire. The angel felt no satisfaction in the kill, only the weight of necessity. These creatures wearing familiar faces were not his brothers, merely echoes of what they had once been, puppets dancing to the tune of powers that cared nothing for human dreams. The memories came unbidden as he fought through deck after deck, Horus laughing as he shared some jest during the Ulanor triumph, his charisma so bright it seemed to illuminate entire star systems. Horus weeping over the body of a fallen brother, his grief so profound that even the Emperor had been moved to comfort him. Horus standing beside Sanguinius on the observation deck of the vengeful spirit herself, back when she had been a symbol of hope rather than corruption, discussing their dreams for humanity's future among the stars. "We shall build something beautiful, brother," Horus had said during one such conversation, his eyes bright with visions of tomorrow. A galaxy where every human child can look up at the stars and know they belong there, not as conquerors, but as inheritors of infinity itself. How had that noble soul become the thing that now waited in the ship's throne room? Sanguinius's enhanced perception showed him glimpses of chaos corruption spreading through the vessel like a cancer. But beneath that taint, he could still sense traces of the brother he had loved. Perhaps that was the cruelest aspect of this tragedy, that somewhere within the monster Horus had become, fragments of the man he had been, still screamed for release. Yet Sanguinius could not afford sentiment, not when the visions had shown him what failure would cost. Each Sons of Horus warrior he dispatched was another step closer to preventing 10 millennia of suffering for his own gene sons. Each bulkhead he passed was a moment closer to the confrontation that would determine whether the Black Rage would curse future generations of blood angels. The angel's movements became a deadly ballet, his sword and wings working in perfect harmony to carve a path through opposition that should have taken hours to overcome. The corrupted Marines began to recognize that something unprecedented was occurring. Word spread through their ranks that the Angel of Baal was aboard their ship, but not as they had expected. This was not the noble martyr come to die beautifully for the inspiration of ages. This was something far more dangerous, a Primarch who fought not with resigned acceptance, but with the fury of someone who refused to accept that fate was immutable. Sanguinius could feel his father's psychic presence elsewhere in the ship, moving with deliberate purpose, but hindered by the warp-spawned obstacles Horus had placed in his path. Rogel Dawn and his imperial fists were fighting their own battles, cutting through traitor forces with the methodical efficiency that had broken siege after siege. But Sanguinius moved faster than either of them, his prophetic sight allowing him to anticipate and avoid the worst of the ship's defenses. The angel's path took him through sections of the vessel where reality itself had begun to break down under the influence of chaos. Here, the walls bled with substances that had never existed in the material universe, and whispers in languages that predated human speech promised power beyond imagination to any who would listen. Yet Sanguinius pressed forward, his purpose burning too brightly to be dimmed by such trivial temptations. As he fought, he could feel the psychic resonance of his sons dying on Terra's surface far below. Each death sent tremors through the connection that bound the blood angels to their Primarch. But now, instead of weakening him, their sacrifice fed his determination. They died believing in his nobility, his righteousness, his willingness to pay any price for humanity's future. He would not make their faith a lie by accepting a martyrdom that served only Chaos's purposes. The throne room's massive doors loomed before him, wreathed in energies that would have driven lesser beings mad. Beyond those barriers waited Horus, the favored son who had traded humanity's future for the empty promises of gods who knew only hunger. Sanguinius had expected to reach this moment exhausted, wounded, prepared for noble death. Instead, he arrived ahead of schedule, his armor barely scratched, his wings spread wide in terrible majesty. When the doors opened at his approach, revealing the throne room beyond, Sanguinius saw his fallen brother for the first time since the rebellion began. Horus sat upon a throne that pulsed with warp energy, his once perfect features now bearing the marks of his corruption. The War Master's eyes widened in genuine surprise as he beheld Sanguinius, for this was not the encounter he had foreseen. "Brother," Horus said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of power beyond mortal understanding. "You are early, and you are—" He paused, his enhanced perceptions recognizing that something fundamental had changed. Different. Sanguinius folded his wings and stepped into the chamber, his blade still singing with the blood of corrupted sons of Horus. When he spoke, his voice carried not the resigned sadness of a martyr, but the terrible certainty of someone who had seen the future and found it wanting. "I have seen what comes after this moment, Horus. I have witnessed 10,000 years of consequence, and I am here to tell you that your victory purchases nothing but suffering. The visions have shown me what my death would cost, and I have decided that some prices are too high to pay." The War Master's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching uncertainty. This was not the Sanguinius he had known, not the noble brother who would choose beautiful death over ugly victory. Something had fundamentally altered in the Angel of Baal, and for the first time since embracing the gifts of chaos, Horus felt a flicker of doubt about the outcome of their confrontation. The chains of destiny, it seemed, were not as unbreakable as the gods had promised. Chapter 3. Brothers in Shadow and Light. The throne room of the vengeful spirit had become something that should never have existed within the material universe. Reality itself bent and twisted around Horus's presence, the very air thick with energies that predated human understanding. Yet as Sanguinius stepped fully into the chamber, his perfect form blazing with righteous fury, the Angel of Baal showed no fear of the corruption that surrounded him. His wings spread wide, casting shadows that seemed to push back against the warp-spawned darkness. And for a moment, the two brothers faced each other, across a gulf that encompassed more than mere physical distance. Horus rose from his throne with fluid grace, the Chaos God's gifts having transformed him into something that retained the echo of his former magnificence, while embodying powers that no Primarch should have wielded. His armor, once the proud gold and green of the lunar wolves, now bore the marks of all four ruinous powers, each competing to claim the War Master as their champion. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond counting. "My beloved brother," Horus began, his words flowing like honey laced with poison, "how long I have waited for this moment. Not for battle, not for bloodshed, but for understanding. You have seen what our father truly is, haven't you? The tyrant who would chain humanity to his vision alone, who would deny us the power to shape our own destiny among the stars." The War Master descended the steps of his throne with deliberate ceremony, each footfall sending ripples through the corrupted deck plating. As he moved, the symbols carved into his armor pulsed with malevolent light, and whispers in languages that had never been spoken by human throats promised infinite power to any who would listen. Yet Sanguinius remained unmoved, his enhanced perception seeing through the illusions to the fundamental truth beneath. "Join me, Sanguinius," Horus continued, his charisma still potent despite the corruption that had claimed him. "Cast aside the chains of filial duty and embrace the freedom that the true powers offer. Together, we can build an empire that spans not just this galaxy, but every reality that exists beyond the warp's barriers. You need not die here as a martyr to a failed dream. You can live as a god among gods." But Sanguinius had heard these words before, not with his ears, but through the prophetic visions that had changed everything. He had seen this exact moment played out in the canonical timeline, watched as his noble refusal had led inevitably to his death and 10 millennia of suffering for his sons. This time, however, his response carried the weight of absolute certainty, born not from faith alone, but from terrible knowledge. "I have seen your victory, brother," Sanguinius replied, his voice cutting through the warp's whispers like a blade through shadow. "In the visions that have been granted to me, I witnessed what comes after this moment if you succeed. Your empire of gods spans the galaxy, yes, but it is empty of everything that makes existence worthwhile. Humanity becomes cattle, bred and harvested for the amusement of beings who understand neither love nor hope nor sacrifice." The angel's words struck Horus with unexpected force, causing the War Master to pause in his advance. Through his connection to the Chaos Gods, Horus could sense that something unprecedented was occurring. This was not the noble, martyrdom-seeking brother he had expected to face. Something fundamental had altered in Sanguinius, granting him knowledge that should have been impossible to possess. "You speak of visions, brother," Horus said, his tone becoming more cautious. "But the future is not fixed. The gods have shown me countless possibilities, all of them leading to humanity's ascension, beyond the limitations our Father would impose. Whatever you think you have seen, it is but one path among infinite potential." Sanguinius stepped forward, his sword singing as it left its sheath, the blade wreathed in energies that blazed brighter than the corrupted lightning that played around the throne room's walls. When he spoke again, his voice carried not the resigned sadness of inevitable martyrdom, but the terrible certainty of someone who had looked into the abyss and found it wanting. "I have seen the truth of what your gods offer, Horus. Eternal stagnation dressed as eternal change. They promise transformation, but deliver only endless repetition of the same base hungers and cruel desires. The galaxy becomes their feeding ground, and humanity nothing more than a briefly amusing morsel in an infinite feast of suffering." The psychic battle began before either brother moved to strike. Horus unleashed the full fury of the warp upon Sanguinius, drawing upon the combined might of Khorne's rage, Tzeentch's cunning, Nurgle's despair, and Slaaneish's excess. The assault would have shattered the mind of any lesser being, but Sanguinius met it not with resistance alone, but with visions of his own. He showed Horus glimpses of the future that awaited, not the glorious apotheosis the Chaos Gods had promised, but the reality of their eternal hunger. Through the psychic link, Horus witnessed his victory's true cost. He saw the imperium transformed into a nightmare realm, where human children were born only to feed demonic appetites, where every world had become a charnel house, dedicated to powers that knew only consumption. The galaxy's beauty, its infinite potential for growth and wonder, had been reduced to nothing more than fuel for beings whose hunger could never be satisfied. "Lies!" Horus snarled, but his voice carried a tremor of doubt that had not been there before. The gods would not. Yet even as he spoke, he could feel the truth of Sanguinius's visions burning through their psychic connection. The Chaos Gods cared nothing for human ascension, only for the suffering that sustained them. Everything else, including Horus himself, was merely a means to that end. The physical confrontation erupted with violence that shook the vengeful spirit to its core. Horus, empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods, struck with speed and fury that should have overwhelmed any opponent. His claws carved through the air where Sanguinius had been standing, leaving tears in reality itself, while his psychic might lashed out in waves that would have reduced continents to ash. Yet the angel of Baal moved with preternatural grace, his enhanced precognition allowing him to see each attack before it was launched. Where the canonical timeline had shown Sanguinius fighting with noble resignation, accepting his fate with the same grace that had defined his entire existence, this version of the angel fought with desperate fury. Every blow he struck was guided by knowledge of what failure would cost, not just for himself, but for countless generations of his gene sons. The black rage and red thirst that would curse the blood angels for 10,000 years, the endless cycle of madness and death that his noble sacrifice would purchase, all of it could be prevented if he simply refused to die beautifully. Sanguinius's blade found its mark, carving a line of fire across Horus's chest that drew forth ichor black as the void between stars. The War Master's roar of pain and rage sent shockwaves through the ship's superstructure, causing bulkheads to buckle and warp under the psychic pressure. Yet even as he bled, Horus struck back with renewed fury, his claws tearing through one of Sanguinius's wings, sending golden feathers burning to the deck like falling stars. But where Sanguinius should have weakened, he instead drew upon a source of strength that Horus hadn't anticipated. Through the psychic bond that connected all blood angels to their Primarch, Sanguinius felt his sons dying on Terra's surface, far below. Each death sent tremors through the connection, but instead of grief, the angel felt their love, their absolute faith in his righteousness and nobility. They died believing that their sacrifice served a greater purpose, and their devotion blazed like stars in the darkness of the warp. "Do you feel them, brother?" Sanguinius asked, as they circled each other, both wounded, but far from defeated. "My sons give their lives not for glory or conquest, but for the dream of a better tomorrow. They believe that their deaths purchase something worthwhile, something pure. I will not make their faith a lie by accepting a martyrdom that serves only your master's hunger." Horus could indeed feel the psychic resonance of the dying blood angels, their life force flowing into their Primarch like a tide of liquid courage. It was a connection born not of chaos corruption, but of genuine love, the kind of bond that the ruinous powers could never truly understand or replicate. For the first time since embracing the gifts of the gods, Horus felt something approaching fear. This was not the confrontation he had foreseen. In every vision the Chaos gods had granted him, Sanguinius had come to die beautifully, to serve as the perfect martyr whose sacrifice would wound the Emperor's heart and ensure the War Master's ultimate victory. But the angel standing before him now fought not with resigned nobility, but with the fury of someone who refused to accept that fate was immutable. The battle escalated beyond anything either brother had expected, their clashing wills threatening to tear the vengeful spirit apart. Psychic energies raged through the throne room like storms given form, while their physical combat carved wounds in the ship's hull that bled atmosphere into the void. With each exchange, Sanguinius grew stronger rather than weaker, drawing upon the love of his sons and the terrible certainty that their suffering could be prevented. For the first time since his fall to chaos, Horus began to understand that he might not emerge victorious from this encounter. The noble brother he had expected to defeat easily had become something far more dangerous, a Primarch who fought not just with superhuman skill, but with the desperate determination of someone who had seen the future and found it unacceptable. The chains of destiny, it seemed, were not unbreakable after all. Chapter 4. The Killing Blow. The throne room had become a battleground that transcended the boundaries of the material universe. Where once the vengeful spirit's command center had been merely vast, It now stretched impossibly in all directions, reality itself warping under the psychic pressure of two demigods locked in mortal combat. The very air burned with energies that should not have existed, while the deck beneath their feet cracked and bled substances that predated human understanding. Sanguinius stood at the chamber's heart, his perfect form now bearing the wounds of battle that would have slain a lesser being. One wing hung at an awkward angle, where Horus's claws had torn through bone and sinew. Golden feathers scattered across the corrupted floor like fallen stars. Blood, luminous as liquid starlight, flowed from a dozen wounds that decorated his armor with patterns of sacrifice and determination. Yet for all the damage he had sustained, the Angel of Baal remained upright, his sword still blazing with righteous fury. Across the chamber, Horus fared little better, though the gifts of chaos sustained him beyond any natural endurance. The War Master's armor bore deep gouges, where Sanguinius's blade had found its mark, and ichor black as the void between galaxies seeped from wounds that pulsed with unnatural energies. His perfect features, once the envy of every Primarch, now bore the marks of genuine uncertainty for the first time since his fall to darkness. The battle had raged for what felt like hours, though time itself had little meaning in this place where the warp pressed so close to reality. Each exchange of blows sent shockwaves through the ship's superstructure, causing bulkheads throughout the vessel to buckle and warp. The corrupted sons of Horus who had tried to enter the chamber to aid their gene-father had been vaporized by the psychic overflow, their forms reduced to component atoms by forces too vast for mortal flesh to withstand. Yet even as the physical confrontation reached its peak, Sanguinius felt another battle being fought in the depths of his soul. Through the psychic bond that connected all blood angels to their Primarch, he experienced every death of his sons, fighting on Terra's surface far below. Each fallen warrior sent tremors through the connection, their final moments blazing across his consciousness like supernovae in the darkness of space. Brother Sergeant Malar of the 3rd Company fell with a bolt round through his primary heart, his last thought a prayer for his Primarch's victory. Captain Osriel of the 7th died with a traitor's blade through his throat, yet managed to whisper Sanguinius's name as the light faded from his eyes. Squad after squad of blood angels gave their lives in the siege lines, holding positions that could not be held, buying time that might never matter, all for the love of a father they would never see again. But instead of weakening him, their sacrifice became his strength. Each death fed the psychic link that bound them, transforming grief into power, loss into determination. The blood angels died not in vain, but in faith, believing that their sacrifice served a purpose greater than themselves. Their love for him blazed through the warp like a beacon, drowning out the whispers of chaos with the pure note of absolute devotion. "Do you feel them dying, brother?" Horus snarled as they circled each other, both breathing hard despite their superhuman endurance. "Your precious sons, bleeding their lives away on Terra's stones, all for the dream of a tyrant who sees them as nothing more than expendable tools." Sanguinius's response came not in words but in action, his sword carving through the air with speed that left after-images burning in its wake. Yet this time, something had changed in his approach. The prophetic gifts that had guided him throughout this confrontation suddenly blazed with unprecedented clarity, showing him not just the immediate future, but the exact instant when Horus's defenses would falter. The vision came like lightning through his consciousness, revealing a moment 3 seconds hence when the War Master would overextend himself in a devastating attack. Sanguinius saw the precise angle of Horus's approach, the millisecond gap in his guard, the exact trajectory required to pierce the corruption that surrounded his brother's heart. But he also saw the cost, the terrible price that would be demanded for this victory. Horus's claws would find their mark, even as Sanguinius's blade pierced his chest. The angel's wings would be shredded beyond repair, his perfect form bearing scars that would never fully heal. He would survive, barely, but forever marked by this moment when he chose ugly victory over beautiful martyrdom. Yet as the prophetic instant approached, Sanguinius felt no hesitation. 10,000 years of suffering for his sons stretched out behind that moment of choice. The black rage and red thirst that would curse countless generations if he failed here. Against such consequences, personal pain meant nothing. His children deserved better than madness born of inherited trauma. The moment arrived like the tolling of a cosmic bell. Horus launched himself forward, with all the fury of the chaos gods flowing through him, his claws wreathed in energies that could unmake reality itself. It was a killing strike, perfectly aimed and utterly devastating, the sort of attack that had claimed the lives of entire armies across the span of the Great Crusade. In the canonical timeline, this would be the moment when Sanguinius died, overwhelmed by power beyond any mortal comprehension. But Sanguinius had seen this instant before, witnessed it in visions that burned with prophetic truth. As Horus committed to his attack, the angel moved not away but forward, accepting the War Master's claws, even as he drove his own blade toward his brother's heart. The corrupted talons tore through his wings like tissue, shredding feathers that had once been symbols of purity and hope. Pain beyond description lanced through his perfect form, as chaos-touched weapons carved wounds that would never fully heal. Yet even as agony threatened to overwhelm him, Sanguinius completed his strike. His sword, blazing with the combined faith of 1,000 dying blood angels, pierced through the psychic barriers that protected Horus, and found the heart that had once beaten with noble purpose. The blade slid between ribs that had been reinforced by the gifts of gods, through flesh that had been made stronger than adamantium, and into the core of what the War Master had become. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Horus's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as he felt his life beginning to ebb, the connection to the Chaos Gods wavering like a candle flame in a hurricane. For the first time since his fall, the War Master experienced something approaching mortality, the sudden understanding that even divine favor could not make one truly immortal. "Impossible," Horus whispered, blood flowing from his lips as his perfect features contorted with pain and confusion. The gods, they promised. Victory was assured. Sanguinius, his own strength failing as shock began to take hold, managed to find the words that had been burning in his heart since the visions first revealed the future's true cost. "Your gods promised you nothing but lies, brother. They care nothing for your victory, only for the suffering it would purchase. I have seen what comes after this moment in every timeline, and I will not allow my sons to pay the price for your damnation." The psychic shockwave that erupted from Horus's death tore through the warp like a scream given form. Across the galaxy, psychers collapsed as the War Master's death cry echoed through dimensions beyond counting. On Terra below, the Chaos forces reeled as their champion's life force was severed, their unholy coordination crumbling as the power that had bound them suddenly vanished. But it was in the deepest reaches of the warp where the true consequences were felt. The 4 Chaos gods, who had invested so much of their power in their chosen champion, shrieked in fury and disbelief as their carefully laid plans crumbled to ash. Khorne's rage shook the foundations of his brass citadel. Tzeentch's schemes collapsed like houses built of cards. Nurgle's garden withered as despair gave way to hope, and Slanesh's symphony of excess became a discordant wail of loss. For a moment that stretched across eternity, the ruinous powers tasted something they had not experienced since their birth from humanity's darkest emotions. Defeat. Not merely setback or delay, but absolute, crushing failure. Their greatest gambit, 10,000 years in the planning, had been undone by the simple refusal of one angel to accept that martyrdom was inevitable. Sanguinius collapsed beside his brother's corpse, his perfect form racked with wounds that would have killed any mortal being. Yet even as consciousness began to slip away, he felt a presence approaching through the twisted corridors of the vengeful spirit. The Emperor had finally reached the throne room, his psychic radiance blazing through the ship like a newborn sun. When the master of mankind entered the chamber, he found a scene that defied every prophecy, every vision of the future that his vast intellect had calculated. Horus lay dead upon the deck, his perfect features frozen in an expression of shock and betrayal, while beside him knelt Sanguinius, barely conscious, but unmistakably alive. The angel's wings were ruined beyond repair, his armor cracked and stained with luminous blood. Yet he lived. "My son," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond number. "You have done the impossible. You have changed fate itself." Sanguinius managed to lift his head, his perfect features marked by pain, but shining with the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I saw what his victory would cost, Father. 10,000 years of suffering for my children, madness and death without end. I could not, would not allow such a future to come to pass." The Emperor knelt beside his wounded son, golden hands blazing with power that could reshape reality itself. Yet for all his vast abilities, the master of mankind could not undo what had been done, could not restore wings that had been sacrificed for victory. He could, however, ensure that Sanguinius survived to see the dawn of the new age his sacrifice had purchased. "Live, my son," the Emperor commanded, his power flowing into Sanguinius like liquid starlight, healing the worst of his wounds while leaving scars that would serve as permanent reminders of this moment. "Live, and help me build the future you have made possible." As consciousness returned fully to the Angel of Baal, he felt the psychic echoes of his son's joy blazing through the warp from Terra below. The Blood Angels still lived, still fought, but now they fought for victory rather than mere survival. The curse that would have claimed them, the madness that would have defined their existence for millennia to come, had been prevented before it could take root. Fate, it seemed, was not as immutable as even gods believed. And in the throne room of the vengeful spirit, beside the corpse of the brother he had loved and been forced to kill, Sanguinius smiled for the first time since the rebellion began. Chapter 5. The Emperor's Gambit. The psychic death scream of Horus Lupercal echoed across Terra like thunder rolling through the depths of eternity. In the siege lines where traitor and loyalist had fought for months, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Chaos Space Marines who had pressed their assault with supernatural coordination suddenly found themselves stumbling, their unholy unity shattered as the psychic beacon that had guided them was extinguished forever. World-eaters who had raged with Khorne's fury collapsed to their knees, their berserker madness replaced by confusion and disorientation. Even the demons that had poured from the warp to serve their champion began to flicker and fade, their anchor to reality severed by the War Master's demise. From the walls of the Imperial Palace, Rogel Dawn felt the change like a physical blow. The Praetorian of Terra had been coordinating the defense from the Barb Bastion, when the psychic shockwave struck, sending him staggering against the ramparts as visions of his brother's death blazed through his consciousness. Yet where another might have been overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had occurred, Dawn's tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. The enemy was leaderless, their coordination broken, their morale shattered. This was the moment that would determine the war's final outcome. "All units," Dawn commanded, his voice cutting through the confusion that gripped both sides of the siege lines. "Immediate advance. The War Master is dead. Press the attack while the enemy reels. Show no mercy, for they would have shown none to Terra." Across the scarred surface of humanity's birth world, the Imperial response was swift and merciless. Imperial fists companies that had held defensive positions for months suddenly found themselves advancing, their yellow armor gleaming in the fires of battle as they reclaimed ground that had been lost to darkness. Blood angels who had fought with desperate valor now pressed forward with renewed purpose, their gene seed singing with joy as they felt their Primarch's survival through bonds that transcended mere flesh. But it was not on Terra's surface that the most significant developments unfolded. High above the world's ravaged atmosphere, aboard the command bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor of mankind stood in perfect health and terrible majesty, where the canonical timeline would have seen him mortally wounded, requiring interment within the Golden Throne to preserve his failing life. This version of the Master of Mankind blazed with undiminished power. His golden armor bore no wounds that mattered, his psychic might unimpaired by the battle that had just concluded. The implications of his continued vitality were staggering. For the first time since the rebellion began, the Emperor could take direct command of the war's final phase. His vast intellect and supernatural abilities focused entirely on the task of ending the threat that chaos represented. No longer would humanity's defenders fight merely to survive. Now they could fight to win decisively. "Malcador," the Emperor spoke, his voice reaching across the void to touch the mind of his most trusted servant, who maintained the psychic barriers that protected Terra from the warp's intrusions. "The immediate crisis has passed. Continue your vigil, but know that your sacrifice will not be required as we had feared. The Golden Throne can wait for more permanent solutions." From his position within the palace's deepest chambers, Malcador the Sigillite felt relief flood through his ancient bones. The plan that would have seen him burn out his life force to maintain the Emperor's work could be set aside, at least for now. The Master of Mankind lived, and with him, humanity's chances of surviving the dark millennium that might otherwise have followed. Yet even as victory on Terra seemed assured, the Emperor's strategic vision extended far beyond the throne world's immediate defense. His psychic senses, unimpaired by mortal wounds, detected the movements of the surviving traitor Primarchs as they realized the magnitude of their defeat. Perturabo's Iron Warriors were already beginning their withdrawal from the siege lines, the Iron Cage's architect recognizing that without Horus to lead them, the rebellion had become a lost cause. The Emperor might have allowed the Iron Warriors to retreat, to lick their wounds in whatever distant strongholds they could find. In the canonical timeline, battered and dying, he had possessed neither the strength nor the opportunity to pursue every fleeing traitor. But this Emperor was whole, his power undiminished, his tactical options unlimited. The Master of Mankind had learned the cost of mercy during the Great Crusade, and he would not repeat the mistake of allowing potential threats to escape. "Perturabo," the Emperor spoke, his psychic voice reaching across the system to touch the mind of the retreating Primarch. "You have chosen your path, and now you must face its consequences. But I offer you this single chance. Surrender yourself for judgment, and your legion will be spared. Continue to flee, and I will hunt you to the galaxy's edge." The response came not in words, but in the sudden acceleration of Iron Warrior ships, their warp drives flaring as they sought to escape the system before the Emperor could make good on his threat. Perturabo had made his choice, and it was one that would echo across the centuries to come. The Emperor marked the Iron Warrior's departure vector and filed it away for future action. They would not escape justice indefinitely, but it was not Perturabo who commanded the Emperor's immediate attention. Somewhere in the outer system, Angron and his World-Eaters continued their rampage through the scattered refugee fleets that had sought shelter behind Terra's defenses. The Red Angel's madness knew no bounds, and even with Horus dead, he would continue killing until every human soul within reach had been added to the mountain of skulls he offered to his patron god. This, the Emperor decided, was a threat that required immediate attention. Unlike Perturabo, who might be contained or even redeemed given time, Angron had passed beyond the point where any mercy could be justified. The World-Eaters. Primarch had become something that was no longer truly his son, a creature of pure rage that existed only to feed Khorne's endless hunger for blood and violence. The Emperor's form began to blaze with power that transcended the merely physical as he prepared to teleport directly into the path of Angron's fleet. This was a luxury that the canonical timeline had never afforded him, the ability to take direct action against threats while his strength remained unimpaired. The Chaos Gods had gambled everything on Horus's victory, and with that gambit failed, their remaining champions would learn the true cost of defying the master of mankind. Meanwhile, in the medical chambers of the Imperial Palace, Sanguinius lay upon a bed of the finest materials Terra could provide, his ruined wings spread carefully to either side as the palace's most skilled apothecaries tended to wounds that would mark him forever. The Angel of Baal remained conscious, despite the magnitude of his injuries, his perfect features bearing an expression of profound contemplation as new visions flickered through his consciousness. But these were not the prophetic nightmares that had driven him to change fate aboard the vengeful spirit. Instead, Sanguinius saw branching possibilities, multiple futures that spread out from this moment like rivers delta, flowing toward different seas. In some, he glimpsed the imperium he had helped to preserve, growing stronger and more unified under his father's continued guidance. In others, he saw new threats emerging to challenge humanity's dominance, alien species, and heretical cults that would test the resolve of future generations. Most significantly, he saw his own sons as they would be in this altered timeline. The Blood Angels who fought below on Terra's surface bore no trace of the madness that would have consumed them in the canonical future. The black rage that should have been their defining curse had been prevented before it could take root, their genetic legacy unmarred by the psychic trauma of their Primarch's death. They would still face trials in the years to come, still struggle with the red thirst that was their inheritance from the genetic template, but they would do so as whole beings rather than broken ones. "My lord," one of the apothecaries spoke with reverent care, "the Emperor has sent word that your recovery proceeds well. He asks if you feel able to receive visitors, as several of your brother Primarchs wish to confirm your survival with their own eyes." Sanguinius managed a smile, despite the pain that lanced through his broken form. "Send them in. After what has passed this day, I think we all have much to discuss about what the future might hold." As the apothecary departed to relay his message, Sanguinius closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction. The visions had shown him what his martyrdom would have cost, and he had refused to pay that price. Instead, he had chosen a different path, one that led not to noble death, but to complicated life. The consequences of that choice would ripple across the centuries to come. But for now, it was enough to know that his sons would not inherit madness alongside his genetic legacy. Outside the medical chamber, the sounds of war were already growing distant as the loyalist forces pressed their advantage against the demoralized traitor army. The siege of Terra was ending, not with the desperate victory of a wounded imperium, but with the decisive triumph of a humanity that had faced the abyss and emerged stronger for the experience. The Emperor's gambit had succeeded beyond even his vast calculations. Horus was dead, the rebellion crumbling, and for the first time since the dark days of Old Night, humanity's future stretched out bright with possibility. Yet even as victory celebrations began in the palace's halls, the master of mankind prepared for the next phase of his eternal war against chaos. The battle for Terra was won, but the war for humanity's soul would continue among the stars. And this time, the Emperor would face that conflict not as a dying god chained to a golden throne, but as an active force for order in a universe that had forgotten the meaning of hope. The true test of what they had accomplished here would be measured not in days or years, but in the millennia to come, when the choices made in this crucible would determine whether humanity ascended to its destined greatness or fell back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The galaxy would remember this day, when fate itself bent before the will of those who refused to accept that some prices were too terrible to pay. Chapter 6. The Crimson Revelation. In the depths of the imperial palace, where shadows danced between golden pillars older than most civilizations, Sanguinius lay in fevered contemplation as his perfect form slowly mended itself. The angel of Baal had survived the encounter that should have claimed his life, but survival, he was learning, carried burdens that martyrdom never could. His wings, once symbols of divine grace, now bore scars that would never fully heal, each torn feather a reminder of the moment when he had chosen ugly victory over beautiful death. Yet it was not physical pain that tormented him in the hours between waking and sleeping, but the visions that came with increasing frequency and terrible clarity. Where once his prophetic gift had shown him glimpses of a single, seemingly inevitable future, now it revealed infinite branching possibilities spreading out from the moment of Horus's death like cracks in shattered glass. Each potential timeline blazed across his consciousness with vivid detail, showing him futures both wondrous and horrifying, all of them consequences of his choice to defy fate aboard the vengeful spirit. The most beautiful visions came first, showing him the blood angels, as they would be in this altered timeline. Sanguinius witnessed his sons in the centuries to come, their nobility unmarred by the madness that would have claimed them. Companies of blood angels fought across distant stars with tactical brilliance and strategic insight, their enhanced psychic potential allowing them to coordinate battle plans with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. No death company marched among their ranks, no black-armored berserkers seeking death to escape inherited trauma. Instead, his gene sons served as paragons of what space marines could become when freed from the burden of genetic curses. He saw Captain Dante in the far future, not as the ancient, weary commander burdened by centuries of watching his brothers fall to madness, but as a leader whose wisdom had been tempered by hope rather than endless loss. Brother librarians channeled their psychic gifts not to contain the Black Rage, but to commune with their Primarch across the void, their abilities enhanced by the prophetic legacy he had chosen to preserve rather than sacrifice. Yet even as these visions filled him with satisfaction, darker possibilities intruded upon his consciousness. Sanguinius saw timelines where his survival led to different forms of corruption, where the absence of the Black Rage allowed other weaknesses to take root in his genetic legacy. In some futures, the Blood Angels became so convinced of their own righteousness that they turned upon other imperial forces, their noble nature twisted into arrogance that brooked no questioning of their methods. In others, their enhanced psychic abilities attracted the attention of entities far worse than Khorne's rage, creatures of the deep warp who offered gifts that seemed beneficent but carried prices beyond imagination. Most disturbing of all were the visions that showed the galaxy itself stagnating under the weight of prevented tragedy. Without the trauma of the canonical timeline, without the desperate struggles that had forged humanity's character in the crucible of endless war, the Imperium grew complacent. Threats that should have been met with righteous fury were instead ignored until they became existential dangers. The very suffering that Sanguinius had sought to prevent had, in its absence, allowed greater sufferings to take root. As these revelations churned through his consciousness, the angel heard the approach of familiar footsteps in the corridor beyond his chamber. The first of his sons had returned from Terra's siege lines, their armor bearing the scars of victory, but their gene seed singing with unprecedented vitality. When Captain Azkaelon of the Sanguinary Guard entered the chamber, Sanguinius immediately perceived the changes that his survival had wrought. The captain's psychic aura blazed brighter than it ever had before. The connection between Primarch and Jeanson strengthened rather than traumatized by recent events, where the canonical timeline would have seen Azkaelon begin the slow descent into the madness that claimed all Blood Angels eventually. This version of his gene-son showed signs of enhanced mental acuity and prophetic sensitivity. The captain's eyes held depths that spoke of visions shared across the psychic link, glimpses of futures that his Primarch's enhanced abilities had inadvertently transmitted to his children. "My lord," Azkaelon said, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been there before the battle. "The remaining traitor forces have withdrawn beyond Terra's orbital defenses. Victory is complete yet." He paused, uncertainty flickering across his perfect features. "I find myself seeing things that have not yet come to pass, fragments of possible futures, glimpses of battles yet unfought. Is this normal, my lord?" Sanguinius studied his gene-son with eyes that now saw far more than they once had. The psychic backlash from killing Horus had not only enhanced his own prophetic abilities, but had begun to awaken similar gifts in his children. This was unprecedented, a fundamental alteration to the Blood Angel's genetic template that would echo across the millennia to come. His survival had changed them at the most basic level, transforming them from warriors prone to madness into something approaching living oracles. "What you experience is real, my son," Sanguinius replied, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "The visions come as a consequence of what has passed between us, a sharing of the gift that has long been my burden and blessing alike. You see fragments of what might be, not what will be. The future remains ours to shape." As more of his sons returned from the siege lines, Sanguinius observed the same phenomenon, repeating throughout the chapter. Blood Angels who had fought in the shadow of the imperial palace reported dreams of distant battles, visions of alien threats that would not emerge for centuries, glimpses of technologies and tactics that had yet to be invented. The prophetic gift that had once been his alone was spreading through his genetic lineage like a beneficial mutation, transforming the Blood Angels into something the galaxy had never seen before. Yet with this revelation came a profound responsibility that weighed upon Sanguinius's shoulders like the burden of Atlas himself. If his sons were becoming oracles, if their enhanced abilities could provide glimpses of threats and opportunities yet to come, then the imperium possessed a strategic advantage beyond anything the emperor had originally envisioned. But such power carried dangers that extended far beyond the merely tactical. The angel of Baal rose from his bed of recovery, his movement still careful, but no longer hindered by the worst of his wounds. The time had come to share his revelations with the one being in the galaxy, whose wisdom might encompass the full scope of what had been unleashed. The emperor would need to know that his son's survival had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate victory over chaos. When Sanguinius entered the emperor's private sanctum, he found the master of mankind standing before a vast window that looked out upon Terra's slowly healing surface. The emperor turned as his son approached, and for a moment the two beings regarded each other with the complex understanding that existed between father and child, creator and created, God and saint. "You bring news of changes within your legion," the emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical. "I have sensed the alterations in their psychic signatures, the enhancement of abilities that were always latent within their genetic structure." Sanguinius nodded, his perfect features bearing an expression of profound contemplation. "The visions have shown me multiple timelines, Father, branching possibilities that spread out from the moment of Horus's death. In some, the gift I have inadvertently shared with my sons serves the imperium well, providing strategic advantages that tip the balance in conflicts yet to come. In others, it leads to stagnation, complacency, or corruption of a different sort than what we have just defeated." The angel shared selective glimpses of what he had witnessed, allowing the emperor to perceive fragments of the futures that might unfold. He showed visions of blood angels serving as the imperium's early warning system against threats that would not emerge for millennia, their prophetic abilities providing crucial intelligence about alien invasions and heretical uprisings. But he also revealed darker possibilities, timelines where the burden of foreknowledge drove his sons to madness of a different sort, or where their warnings were ignored until the very dangers they sought to prevent came to pass. The emperor absorbed these revelations with the vast intellect that had guided humanity's rise from the ashes of old night, his consciousness processing implications that would have overwhelmed lesser minds. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions that would shape the galaxy's future for millennia to come. "The gift you have awakened in your sons is unprecedented," the emperor said, "a development that extends beyond my original designs for the Legends Astartes. Yet it offers opportunities that we must not squander through caution or fear. The question becomes not whether to use this ability, but how to employ it wisely." It was then that Sanguinius made the choice that would define not only his own future, but the role his legion would play in the centuries to come. No longer would he be merely a general who led from the front, a noble warrior whose greatest service was the inspiration his presence provided to others. Instead, he would become something the imperium had never possessed, an oracle whose visions could guide humanity through the darkness of an uncertain future. "I will serve as the imperium's prophet, Father," Sanguinius declared, his voice carrying the certainty of absolute conviction. "Not to dictate what must come to pass, for I have seen the dangers of such presumption, but to illuminate the paths that lie before us. My sons will become the instruments through which these visions reach those who must act upon them." The emperor regarded his son for a long moment, weighing the implications of such a profound change to the imperium's structure. Finally, he nodded with something approaching satisfaction. "Then let it be so. But remember, my son, that the greatest gift prophecy offers is not knowledge of what will be, but understanding of what can be prevented. Use your visions not to ensure specific outcomes, but to help humanity choose wisely among the infinite possibilities that await us. As the conversation concluded, Sanguinius felt a weight settle upon his shoulders that was different from the burden of command he had carried during the Great Crusade. This was the responsibility of one who sees too much, who knows too well the price of every choice and the cost of every path not taken. Yet he accepted it willingly, for he had learned aboard the Vengeful Spirit that some burdens were too important to be avoided through the simple expedient of noble death. The angel of Baal had survived his encounter with fate, and in doing so had become something greater and more terrible than any mere Primarch. He was now humanity's guide through the labyrinth of possible futures, a beacon whose light would illuminate the darkness of uncertainty for as long as his perfect form endured. The galaxy would remember this day, not only for the death of a traitor, but for the birth of hope, guided by wisdom. And in the chambers of the imperial palace, Sanguinius prepared for the long vigil that would define the rest of his existence. Chapter 7. The Reckoning of Traitors. The galaxy had never witnessed the Emperor of mankind unleashed without restraint, his terrible magnificence directed entirely toward the prosecution of vengeance against those who had dared to wound humanity's dream, where the canonical timeline would have seen him chained to the golden throne, slowly dying while his realm crumbled around him. This version of the master of mankind blazed across the stars like a force of nature given terrible purpose, with Malcador maintaining the psychic barriers that protected Terra and the golden throne functioning without requiring his personal sacrifice. The Emperor was free to pursue the fleeing traitor Primarchs with all the fury that 10,000 years of planning and hope could summon. The first to feel his wrath was Angron, the Red Angel whose madness had consumed entire star systems during his rampage through the outer reaches of the Sol system. The World Eater's Primarch had continued his slaughter even after Horus's death, his connection to Khorne overriding any tactical understanding of when a war was lost. Refugee fleets that had sought shelter behind Terra's defenses became his hunting grounds, their civilian populations butchered to feed the blood god's endless appetite for death and suffering. But Angron had made a fundamental miscalculation in assuming that the Emperor's victory would follow the same patterns as previous conflicts, with slow pursuit and eventual containment, rather than immediate, devastating retaliation. When the master of mankind materialized aboard the World Eater's flagship in the Ghoul Stars, his golden form blazing with psychic power that turned the very air to plasma, Angron realized too late that he faced not a wounded father seeking to redeem a wayward son, but an avenging deity whose patience had finally reached its end. The confrontation lasted less than a minute in real time, though the psychic echoes would reverberate through the warp for centuries. Angron's rage, enhanced by decades of Khorne's gifts and the butcher's nails that had driven him beyond sanity, met the Emperor's fury like a candle flame meeting the heart of a star. There was no dramatic duel, no exchange of words heavy with meaning and regret. The Emperor simply unmade his fallen son with a thought, reducing the Red Angel to component atoms while his gene seed screamed across the void in harmonics that spoke of endings without redemption. The destruction of Angron sent shockwaves through the remaining traitor Primarchs, who had expected pursuit but not annihilation, delivered with such cold efficiency. Fulgrim, the Phoenician whose pursuit of perfection had led him into Slanesh's embrace, attempted to flee toward the Eye of Terror, where the barriers between reality and the warp would provide some protection from his father's wrath. Yet even there, in the realm where chaos held sway, the Emperor's reach proved inescapable. The Eternal Crusader, Rogel Dawn's flagship, translated into the warp near the eye's edge, just as Fulgrim's forces prepared to make their final transition to safety. But it was not Dawn who commanded the vessel's assault, but the Emperor himself, his presence turning the ship into a beacon of absolute authority that burned through the immaterium's chaotic currents like a blade of pure order. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a manifestation of cosmic forces, reality itself bending under the pressure of competing wills. Fulgrim escaped, barely, his perfect form bearing wounds that would mark him forever as one who had faced the Emperor's unveiled fury and survived only through the intervention of his patron deity. Yet even as he fled into the eye's deepest reaches, the Phoenician carried with him the knowledge that nowhere in the galaxy would be truly safe from his father's pursuit. The Emperor had demonstrated that even the Chaos God's protection had limits when faced with the focused wrath of one who had once walked among them as an equal. Meanwhile, in the cold depths of space, where Mortarian's Death Guard fleet had sought to regroup after their defeat at Terra, the Pale King discovered that his mastery of biological warfare meant nothing when faced with an opponent who existed beyond such mortal concerns. The Emperor's arrival aboard the Endurance was heralded not by the usual signs of teleportation, but by the sudden cessation of all decay throughout the ship. Nurgle's gifts simply stopped functioning in his presence, their corruption unable to maintain cohesion when confronted by the pure concept of order made manifest. What followed was not death for Mortarion, but something far worse. The Emperor bound his son in chains forged from his own despair, ensuring that the Death Lord would spend eternity fully aware of the futility of his rebellion while remaining powerless to act upon that knowledge. It was a fate that even Nurgle's greatest champions feared, conscious existence without the possibility of change or growth, forever trapped in the moment of realization that their choices had led only to meaningless suffering. The fate of Magnus the Red proved different, though no less terrible in its implications. The Crimson King had maintained some vestige of his original nobility despite his fall to Cinch, and when he approached the Emperor under a flag of truce near the ruins of Prospero, hope flickered in his eye that reconciliation might yet be possible. Magnus spoke of his regret, his desire to undo the damage his arrogance had caused, his willingness to accept any punishment if it meant serving the Imperium once more. But the Emperor's response was final and absolute. Trust, once broken by betrayal of such magnitude, could never be fully restored. Magnus's knowledge of the warp made him too dangerous to be allowed freedom. Yet his continued existence as an enemy would pose an ongoing threat to humanity's future. The solution was as elegant as it was cruel. The Emperor stripped Magnus of his connection to the warp entirely, leaving the Crimson King as a hollow shell of what he had once been, alive but powerless, aware but unable to access the knowledge that had defined his existence. Throughout these campaigns of retribution, Sanguinius remained on Terra, his enhanced prophetic abilities providing crucial intelligence that guided Imperial forces to victory after victory. The Angel's visions revealed the locations of hidden traitor strongholds, the timing of enemy movements, the weak points in their defenses that could be exploited for maximum effect. Under his guidance, Imperial fleets struck with precision that seemed almost supernatural, their attacks coordinated across vast distances by intelligence that arrived before conventional communications could carry the news. Yet, as Sanguinius watched these victories unfold through his prophetic sight, he began to perceive disturbing patterns in the visions that came to him. The Emperor's pursuit of the traitor Primarchs was achieving its tactical objectives, but at a cost that extended far beyond the immediate casualties of war. Each act of retribution, each demonstration of unchecked power, moved the imperium further away from the dream of enlightenment that had originally inspired the Great Crusade. The surviving loyalist primarchs, witnessing their father's terrible efficiency in dealing with their fallen brothers, began to understand that the emperor they had known was but a fraction of what he truly was. Guilliman, ever the pragmatist, adapted quickly to this new reality, but his carefully structured plans for imperial governance began to incorporate elements of authoritarian control that would have been unthinkable before Terra's siege. The Lion, always suspicious of hidden motives, found his paranoia validated as he realized that even he had never truly understood the depths of his father's nature. Most disturbing of all was the reaction of ordinary humans throughout the Imperium as word of the Emperor's victories spread. Where the canonical timeline would see him elevated to godhood through millennia of gradual mythologizing, this version of the master of mankind inspired worship through the immediate demonstration of his divine power. Worlds that had maintained some vestige of secular governance abandoned such pretenses, declaring themselves theocracies devoted entirely to the emperor's will. The imperial truth, that careful rejection of supernatural belief that had guided the Great Crusade, crumbled before the evidence of their ruler's obvious divinity. In the depths of the imperial palace, as reports of each victory reached Terra, Sanguinius found himself questioning whether the future he had fought to preserve was truly better than the one he had prevented. The visions showed him an imperium growing stronger, more unified, more capable of defending itself against the threats that would emerge in the millennia to come. Yet they also revealed the slow death of human agency, as populations across the galaxy surrendered their capacity for independent thought in exchange for the comfort of absolute certainty in their ruler's divine nature. The angel realized with growing unease that his survival had prevented one form of stagnation only to enable another. Where the canonical timeline would see humanity ground down by endless warfare and bureaucratic decay, this version promised a different kind of death, the gradual transformation of human civilization into something that served the Emperor's will perfectly, but had lost all connection to the dreams and aspirations that made existence worthwhile. As the Emperor's campaigns of retribution continued across the galaxy, eliminating traitor strongholds with surgical precision, guided by Sanguinius's prophetic sight, the angel began to understand that victory itself could be a form of defeat. The Chaos Gods had gambled everything on corrupting the Emperor's most beloved son, and in their failure had inadvertently achieved something perhaps even more destructive. They had forced the master of mankind to reveal the true extent of his power, stripping away the carefully maintained illusions that had allowed humanity to believe itself capable of independent growth. The reckoning of traitors was proceeding exactly as planned, yet Sanguinius found himself wondering if the price of that success would ultimately prove higher than the cost of the failure he had prevented. In seeking to save his sons from 10 millennia of madness, had he instead condemned all of humanity to a different kind of eternal suffering, the slow death of hope beneath the weight of absolute certainty? The visions offered no easy answers, only the terrible understanding that even the most noble choices carried consequences that extended far beyond their immediate effects. As the last of the traitor primarchs fell before the Emperor's wrath, Sanguinius prepared himself for the far more difficult task of guiding humanity through the aftermath of total victory, when the absence of external threats would force the Imperium to confront the darkness that victory itself had birthed within its heart. Chapter 8. The Prophet's Burden. The visions came now without warning, blazing across Sanguinius's consciousness like lightning strikes that left his perfect mind scarred with glimpses of futures yet millennia distant. Where once his prophetic gift had been a gentle whisper of possibility, it had become a roaring torrent of potential timelines that threatened to drown his sanity in the sheer scope of what might come to pass. The angel of Baal stood in his private sanctum within the imperial palace, his hands pressed against the ancient stone as another wave of foresight crashed over him, showing him horrors that would not emerge for 10,000 years. He saw them as clearly as if they stood before him in the flesh, though they had not yet evolved beyond the most primitive forms of life in their distant galaxy. The Tyranids, a hunger given form and purpose, their bioships blotting out entire star systems as they consumed everything in their path. The visions showed him hive fleet after hive fleet arriving at the galaxy's edge, each one larger and more terrifying than the last, their collective consciousness focused entirely on the consumption of biomass until nothing remained but empty void. In other futures, he witnessed the rise of the Tau Empire, their naive philosophy of the greater good, masking an expansion that would challenge the Imperium's dominance in ways that brute force could never counter. He saw their battle suits striding across worlds that humanity had claimed as its birthright, their advanced technology making mockeries of imperial doctrines that had remained unchanged for millennia. Most disturbing of all were the visions of awakening metal as the Necrons stirred from their great sleep to reclaim a galaxy that had forgotten their ancient dominion. Sanguinius witnessed tomb worlds activating across the Rim territories, their inhabitants rising with technologies that made even the dark age of technology seem primitive by comparison. The Citan, star gods who had devoured entire species for sustenance, would walk among the stars once more, their hunger as terrible as that of the approaching Tyranids, but infinitely more patient in its expression. These glimpses of distant futures had begun to define Sanguinius's existence more completely than the present ever could. When he met with the Emperor in council, when he guided imperial forces to victory against present threats, when he walked among his own gene sons, his consciousness remained divided between what was and what might yet be. The burden of such knowledge pressed upon his shoulders like the weight of galaxies, each vision a responsibility that demanded action, yet offered no clear path forward. "Father," Sanguinius said during one such council session, his voice carrying the weariness of one who had seen too much, "the visions show me threats that will not emerge for thousands of years, yet their danger to the Imperium cannot be understated. We must begin preparations now, laying foundations for defenses that our descendants will need to complete." The Emperor, resplendent in his golden armor, as he reviewed reports of imperial compliance throughout the galaxy, paused in his deliberations to regard his prophetic son with something approaching concern. The master of mankind's vast intellect could perceive the strain that the enhanced visions placed upon Sanguinius, the way they pulled his consciousness away from immediate concerns toward distant possibilities that might never come to pass. "Your gift has grown beyond what either of us anticipated," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the physical. "Yet I wonder if you see too clearly, my son. The future is mutable, shaped by countless decisions yet unmade. To act upon visions of what might be risks, creating the very disasters you seek to prevent." But Sanguinius had already committed the Blood Angels to becoming the Imperium's early warning system, their enhanced psychic abilities spreading throughout the chapter as more of his gene sons began to manifest prophetic gifts of their own. Companies of Blood Angels reported visions during routine patrols, glimpses of threats that would not manifest for centuries, but demanded immediate investigation. The chapter's librarians worked tirelessly to catalogue and interpret these prophetic fragments, building archives of potential futures that grew more comprehensive and more terrifying with each passing day. Yet it was precisely this success that led to the first great failure of Sanguinius's oracle role. A vision had come to him with unusual clarity, showing a rebellion on the world of Macraga that would see Robout Guilliman corrupted by chaos powers and turned against the Imperium. The images burned through his consciousness with vivid detail, his brother's perfect features twisted by demonic influence, the Ultramarines trading their noble blue for the colors of traitors, entire sectors falling to darkness as the most loyal of the Primarchs became the most dangerous of enemies. Acting on this vision, Sanguinius had urged the Emperor to take preemptive action against a threat that existed only in potential. Imperial forces had been dispatched to Macraga under the pretense of routine inspection, but their true purpose was to investigate any signs of corruption within the Ultramarines' legion. The resulting confrontation had nearly shattered the bonds of brotherhood between Primarchs, as Guilliman's righteous fury at being suspected of treachery had led to the first serious fracture in loyalist unity since the heresy's end. "You accuse me based on dreams and shadows," Guilliman had raged during their confrontation in the halls of Macraga's fortress, his perfect features flushed with anger that Sanguinius had never seen before. "I have bled for the Imperium, sacrificed everything for the Emperor's vision, and you repay that loyalty with suspicion, born of visions that may never come to pass." The worst part was that Guilliman's anger was entirely justified. As the investigation proceeded and found no trace of corruption within the Ultramarines, Sanguinius began to realize that his vision had been not a glimpse of the future, but a reflection of his own fears, a possibility so remote that it existed only in the deepest reaches of probability. Yet by acting upon it, he had created a rift between loyal Primarchs that would take decades to heal, if it ever could be healed at all. This failure forced Sanguinius to confront the fundamental paradox of prophetic knowledge. The very act of seeing the future changed it, making visions unreliable guides for action. Each time he acted to prevent a disaster glimpsed in visions, he altered the conditions that would lead to that disaster, creating new timelines that his gift struggled to perceive clearly. The future became a labyrinth of branching possibilities, each choice creating new paths that led to different forms of triumph and catastrophe. The ethical implications of such power weighed heavily upon the angel's noble soul. If his visions showed him a threat emerging from a particular sector, did he have the right to preemptively destroy entire worlds to prevent its manifestation? If he saw corruption taking root within a chapter of Space Marines, was he justified in condemning them based on crimes they had not yet committed? The line between preventing disaster and creating it began to blur as Sanguinius struggled with choices that no being should be forced to make. His gene sons suffered alongside him, their own enhanced psychic abilities making them privy to fragments of the visions that tormented their Primarch. Blood Angel's librarians began to experience prophetic dreams that left them questioning the nature of reality itself, while Battle Brothers reported seeing enemies that would not exist for millennia stalking them through the corridors of their ship. The chapter that had been freed from the curse of the Black Rage now faced a different kind of madness, the crushing weight of knowledge that extended far beyond their ability to act upon it effectively. "We see too much," Brother Librarian Mephiston confessed to Sanguinius during one of their regular consultations, his perfect features bearing lines of strain that spoke of sleepless nights spent wrestling with visions of distant futures. "The gifts you have shared with us show us wonders and terrors in equal measure. But we lack the wisdom to know which visions demand action, and which should be allowed to unfold as fate determines. It was during this period of growing uncertainty that Sanguinius received perhaps the most disturbing vision of all, a glimpse of himself in the far future, transformed by millennia of prophetic burden into something that was no longer recognizably the angel his sons had loved. In this potential timeline, the weight of constant foresight had driven him to a kind of divine madness, where his attempts to prevent disasters had become so extreme that he had become a greater threat to the imperium than any of the enemies he sought to forestall. The vision showed him commanding fleets that burned entire sectors to prevent corruptions that might someday take root there, ordering the execution of loyal servants based on crimes they would commit in potential futures, transforming the blood angels into instruments of prophetic terror that enforced his will across the galaxy. In trying to save humanity from every possible threat, he had become the greatest threat of all, a tyrant whose justification for atrocity was always the prevention of greater atrocity yet to come. This revelation shattered something fundamental within Sanguinius's psyche, forcing him to confront the possibility that his survival and enhanced abilities might ultimately prove more destructive than his canonical martyrdom would have been. The black rage that should have cursed his sons for 10,000 years seemed almost merciful compared to the burden of prophetic knowledge that threatened to drive both Primarch and Chapter to a different kind of damnation. As he stood in his sanctum, wrestling with visions that pulled his consciousness in 1,000 different directions, Sanguinius began to understand why the Emperor had always been so careful about revealing the full scope of his own foresight. Some knowledge was too terrible to bear, some futures too complex to be safely altered by mortal intervention. The gift he had gained through killing Horus was becoming a curse that threatened not just his own sanity, but the stability of the imperium itself. For the first time since his survival aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Sanguinius found himself questioning whether he had truly saved the galaxy, or merely delayed its destruction, while ensuring that when the end came, it would be by his own hand, rather than through the madness of his sons. The angel who had refused to die beautifully for the inspiration of ages now faced the far more difficult task of learning to live with wisdom he was never meant to possess. The future stretched out before him in all its terrible complexity, each vision a reminder that even the noblest intentions could pave roads to damnation when guided by knowledge that transcended the boundaries of mortal understanding. And in the depths of the imperial palace, surrounded by the artifacts of 10,000 years of human achievement, Sanguinius began the long, painful process of learning which fates were meant to be changed and which were meant to unfold as destiny intended, regardless of the cost to those who had the wisdom to see them coming. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The reports arrived at the imperial palace with the cold precision of bureaucracy, yet their contents spoke of horrors that no amount of administrative language could disguise. Across 36 star systems in the galactic northeast, worlds that had known peace for decades were dying in ways that defied both explanation and comprehension. The populations of these planets were found in perfect preservation, their bodies unmarked by violence, yet completely drained of what could only be described as their essential humanity, leaving behind empty shells that retained the appearance of life while containing nothing of its substance. Sanguinius stood before the holodisplay in the palace's strategic center, his perfect features drawn with the weight of knowledge that extended far beyond what the reports could convey. Through his enhanced prophetic sight, he perceived the true nature of the threat that was emerging from the ghoul stars, drawn by the psychic echoes of Angron's destruction years before. The Red Angel's annihilation had sent ripples through the warp that reached into dimensions where things slumbered that should never have been awakened, entities whose hunger was for concepts rather than mere flesh. "The umbral devourers," he whispered, the words carrying harmonics that made nearby serfs shiver despite not understanding their significance. "They feed not on life, but on the possibility of life, consuming potential futures until nothing remains but empty present moments stretching toward inevitable extinction." The irony was not lost upon him that his greatest victory had birthed this new horror. By choosing to kill Horus rather than die nobly, by preventing the canonical timeline and all its attendant suffering, he had created space in the galaxy's fate for different forms of damnation to take root. The umbral devourers were not entities that existed in the original future he had witnessed. They were consequences of his interference, attracted by the psychic wound left by a Primarch's complete destruction rather than mere defeat. Meanwhile, his own gene sons continued their strange evolution away from the curse he had prevented. Without the Black Rage to serve as a crucible for their genetic potential, the Blood Angels had developed abilities that were both wondrous and deeply unsettling. Companies reported that their battle brothers could now sense the emotional resonance of objects by touch, experiencing the final moments of anyone who had died near a particular weapon or piece of armor. This gift proved tactically useful in investigation and reconnaissance, but it came with a psychological cost that manifested differently than the madness he had prevented. Brother Captain Erasta of the 5th Company exemplified these changes when he entered Sanguinius's presence, his perfect features bearing the peculiar serenity of one who had witnessed too many deaths through psychic impression. The captain's report detailed how his squad had tracked a cult uprising by following the emotional echoes left in the weapons of fallen guardsmen, but his eyes held depths that spoke of experiencing countless final moments that were not his own. "My lord," Erasta said, his voice carrying undertones that had not been there in the years before the siege of Terra, "we have eliminated the heretical elements on Varagon Prime, but the victory feels hollow. Through the gift you have shared with us, we experienced their deaths as they experienced them, felt their terror and pain as if it were our own. Is this wisdom, or merely a different form of the curse we were meant to bear?" The question cut deeper than any physical wound could have, forcing Sanguinius to confront the possibility that his son's freedom from one genetic flaw had merely opened the door for others to manifest. The Blood Angels were becoming something unprecedented in Imperial history, a chapter of Space Marines who carried the accumulated emotional weight of every battlefield they had ever fought upon. Where the Black Rage would have driven them to madness and death, this new burden promised a different kind of slow torment, the gradual accumulation of others' suffering until they became repositories of galactic pain. Yet even as these concerns weighed upon his consciousness, darker revelations emerged from the strategic assessments that reached his desk each day. The Emperor's continued active rule, freed from the necessity of maintaining the Golden Throne through personal sacrifice, had indeed brought stability and strength to the Imperium. Yet it had also prevented the development of innovations and adaptations that the canonical timeline's desperate circumstances would have forced upon humanity. The Adeptus Mechanicus, no longer driven by the desperate need to maintain failing technologies without Imperial oversight, had grown complacent in their technological development. The Space Marine chapters, secure in the knowledge that their Emperor Father actively guided their campaigns, had failed to develop the tactical innovations that 10,000 years of desperate survival would have demanded. Even the Imperial Guard, though stronger and better equipped than their canonical counterparts, lacked the grim determination that endless warfare against impossible odds would have forged within them. Most disturbing of all were the intelligence reports that detailed how the surviving Chaos gods were adapting to this new timeline, seeding different forms of corruption that exploited the very peace and prosperity that the Imperium now enjoyed. Where the canonical future would have seen humanity ground down by endless warfare, this version faced subtle erosions of purpose and meaning as populations grew soft under the protection of an obviously divine ruler. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, had proven most adept at exploiting these altered circumstances. Without the constant threat of extinction to unite humanity in purpose, the Lord of Change sowed seeds of intellectual pride and philosophical division that threatened to fracture the Imperium from within. Entire sectors began to develop interpretations of the imperial truth that contradicted each other, each claiming divine revelation from the Emperor himself to support their positions. Slaanesh, too, found fertile ground in the prosperity that imperial victory had brought. Worlds that should have been too busy surviving to indulge in excess instead became breeding grounds for cults that preached the exploration of sensation and experience as expressions of gratitude for the Emperor's protection. The very peace that Sanguinius had fought to preserve became a weapon that the Dark Prince could turn against humanity's spiritual health. It was during the naval engagement at the Kythera Nebula that Sanguinius faced his most devastating choice since the moment aboard the Vengeful Spirit. His prophetic visions showed him two potential outcomes of the battle. He could intervene directly, saving the lives of thousands of Imperial Navy personnel who would otherwise die in the engagement, or he could allow events to unfold as fate intended, accepting their deaths as the price for tactical innovations that would save millions in conflicts yet to come. The Imperial fleet under Admiral Caritas faced an enemy force of traitor ships that had allied themselves with the Umbral Devourers, their hulls wreathed in darkness that consumed light itself. Through his enhanced sight, Sanguinius could perceive exactly how the battle would unfold if he remained distant, watching as brave sailors died to learn lessons that would reshape imperial naval doctrine for the better. Yet he also saw the alternative, where his intervention would save those lives but prevent the tactical evolution that their sacrifice would purchase. As he stood upon the bridge of the Red Terra, watching the engagement unfold through the ship's view screen, Sanguinius felt the weight of godlike responsibility threatening to crush even his superhuman spirit. Every choice he made rippled across time in ways that created more choices, each decision spawning consequences that demanded further intervention or acceptance. The prophetic burden that had once seemed like a gift now revealed itself as a curse that made him complicit in every tragedy he chose not to prevent. "My lord," Azkaelon spoke beside him, the captain's voice heavy with concern that extended beyond the immediate battle. "The visions are consuming you. Your brothers have begun to whisper that perhaps your survival was not the blessing we believed it to be. They see how the gift tears at your soul, and they wonder if noble death might have been kinder than this endless weight of choice." The words struck home because they carried truth that Sanguinius could no longer deny. In the years since killing Horus, he had prevented countless disasters through prophetic intervention. Yet each prevented catastrophe seemed to birth new forms of suffering that his visions could barely comprehend. The galaxy was becoming a place where cause and effect had grown so complex that even his enhanced sight struggled to trace the consequences of any given action across the web of possibility that stretched toward infinity. As the battle raged before them, Sanguinius made his choice, but for the first time since, aboard the Vengeful Spirit, he was no longer certain it was the right one. He allowed the engagement to proceed without his intervention, watching as Admiral Caritas made the tactical errors that would cost thousands of lives, but teach lessons that would save millions. The weight of those deaths settled upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead, each lost soul a reminder that the power to change fate came with responsibilities that no being should be forced to bear. In the aftermath of the battle, as Imperial forces regrouped and began to implement the tactical innovations that the engagement had necessitated, Sanguinius retreated to his private sanctum to wrestle with visions that had grown too complex for sanity to encompass. He saw futures where his intervention had prevented every disaster, creating a galaxy so safe and prosperous that humanity lost the very qualities that made it worth preserving. He witnessed timelines where his restraint had allowed necessary struggles to forge stronger characters, but at costs in suffering that made him weep tears of liquid starlight. The angel of bile began to understand that prophecy was not a gift, but a test, one that measured not the ability to prevent suffering, but the wisdom to know which suffering served purposes greater than the pain it caused. Yet with that understanding came a different kind of madness, the terrible clarity of one who could see all possible futures, but lacked the certainty to know which path led toward genuine hope, rather than merely the illusion of salvation. In the depths of the imperial palace, as reports continued to arrive of new threats emerging from the alterations his survival had created, Sanguinius prepared for the most difficult phase of his existence. He would need to learn not just to see the future, but to choose which futures deserved to exist, even when those choices demanded accepting tragedies that he possessed the power to prevent. The gathering storm was not one of external threats alone, but of the consequences that flowed from every attempt to improve upon fate's design. And at its center stood an angel who had learned too late that the greatest burdens were carried not by those who died for noble causes, but by those who lived to face the endless complexity of choice that survival demanded. Chapter 10. The Weight of Eternity. The vision came to Sanguinius not as a gentle whisper of possibility, but as a thunderclap of absolute certainty that shattered every assumption he had held about the righteousness of his choice. In the depths of his private sanctum, as the angel of bile meditated upon the growing crisis that threatened to consume the blood angels from within, the full scope of what his survival had wrought blazed across his consciousness with devastating clarity. For the first time since killing Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, he perceived not fragments of potential futures, but the complete tapestry of consequence that stretched across 10,000 years of altered history. He witnessed the timeline he had created in all its terrible completeness, seeing how his refusal to die beautifully had indeed prevented the grimdark stagnation of the canonical 41st millennium. The Emperor remained active. The imperium grew stronger with each passing century, and the threats that should have consumed humanity in darkness were met with coordinated resistance guided by prophetic foresight. Yet as the millennia unfolded before his enhanced sight, Sanguinius began to perceive the subtle poison that grew within this apparent success. Without the desperate struggle that 10,000 years of barely survived catastrophes would have forged, humanity grew soft in ways that were almost imperceptible at first, but catastrophic in their ultimate expression. The innovations born of desperation never emerged. The tactical flexibility that came from facing impossible odds remained undeveloped, and most critically, the grim determination that had always been humanity's greatest strength slowly withered beneath the comfort of obvious divine protection. When the Tyranids finally arrived at the galaxy's edge in this altered timeline, they faced not the desperate, battle-hardened defenders of the canonical future, but a humanity that had grown complacent beneath the Emperor's active guidance. The Great Devourer's advance was not the grinding, costly campaign of the original timeline, but a systematic consumption that encountered resistance, too structured, too predictable, too reliant upon prophetic warnings to adapt when those visions proved insufficient against a foe that existed partially outside the normal flow of causality. Sanguinius watched in horror as his improved future led to humanity's extinction, not through the slow death of bureaucratic decay, but through the swift annihilation of a species that had forgotten how to fight without the certainty of divine intervention. The very strength he had sought to preserve had become weakness when tested against truly alien intelligence that operated by rules his prophetic gifts could not fully comprehend. Yet even as this revelation crushed his spirit, the vision expanded to show him the alternative he had prevented. The canonical timeline stretched out in all its grimdark magnificence, 10,000 years of suffering that forged humanity into something capable of surviving against impossible odds. He saw the Emperor entombed upon the golden throne, neither fully alive nor truly dead, his sacrifice becoming the foundation for a species that learned to endure through the darkest of ages. The Blood Angels bore the curse of the Black Rage, but that curse became a crucible that refined their nobility into something that could inspire hope even in the galaxy's darkest corners. The bitter irony was not lost upon him that in seeking to spare his sons the madness of inherited trauma, he had condemned all of humanity to a different kind of madness, the slow erosion of the qualities that made survival possible when the universe itself became an enemy. The Black Rage that he had prevented would have been terrible for his gene sons, yet it would also have been a constant reminder that nobility required sacrifice, that strength could only be maintained through the acceptance of necessary suffering. As these visions tore through his consciousness like daggers of liquid starlight, Sanguinius became aware of another presence in his sanctum. The Emperor stood at the chamber's threshold, his golden form radiating power that had once seemed like salvation, but now carried undertones of something far more complex and troubling. The master of mankind's vast intellect had perceived the nature of the visions that tormented his son, and his expression bore the weight of understanding that extended across eons of possibility. "You have seen the full scope of what your choice has wrought," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical. "The question that weighs upon you now is whether the knowledge of consequence negates the righteousness of the original decision." Sanguinius raised his head to meet his father's gaze, his perfect features bearing lines of strain that spoke of burdens too vast for any single consciousness to bear. "I sought to save my sons from 10 millennia of madness, yet in doing so, I may have doomed all of humanity to extinction by a different path." How do we measure the worth of such a choice? How do we weigh individual suffering against species survival? The philosophical complexity of the question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge, ready to cut regardless of which direction it fell. The Emperor moved closer, his presence filling the chamber with energies that bent reality around concepts of duty, sacrifice, and the terrible burden of choice that fell upon those with the power to shape destiny itself. "The curse you prevented was more than mere genetic flaw," the Emperor replied, his words carrying the weight of cosmic understanding. "The Black Rage served as humanity's reminder that nobility demands sacrifice, that strength can only be preserved through the acceptance of necessary pain. In sparing your sons that burden, you removed one of the crucibles that would have forged our species into something capable of surviving the trials yet to come." Even as they spoke, Reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy, detailing the crisis that was consuming the Blood Angels from within. Without the Black Rage to serve as an outlet for the genetic pressures that built within their enhanced physiology, Sanguinius's gene sons were developing new forms of instability that proved even more dangerous than the madness he had prevented. Companies reported brothers who could no longer distinguish between their own memories and the psychic impressions they absorbed from objects and environments, warriors whose enhanced empathy had become so acute that they experienced the emotional states of entire populations simultaneously. Captain Dante of the Second Company had entered a catatonic state after touching the armor of a fallen brother. His consciousness lost within an infinite loop of experienced deaths that stretched across centuries of accumulated psychic impression. Brother Librarian Mephiston had begun to manifest multiple personalities, each one representing a different future self-glimpsed through prophetic visions, their conflicting desires threatening to tear his psyche apart from within. The cruel truth was becoming undeniable. The genetic template that the Emperor had crafted for the Blood Angels required the Black Rage as a pressure valve, a way for the accumulated spiritual weight of their enhanced nature to find expression and release. Without it, that pressure built in different ways that proved even more destructive to their sanity and effectiveness as warriors. "I have the power to restore what was taken," Sanguinius said, his voice carrying the terrible certainty of one who had glimpsed the full scope of possibility. "To undo my survival, to accept the martyrdom that should have been mine, to allow the timeline to correct itself toward the path that offers humanity its best chance of long-term survival." The words hung in the air between father and son like a death sentence pronounced upon hope itself. The Emperor regarded his favored child with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, his vast consciousness weighing the implications of a choice that would determine not just the fate of the Blood Angels, but the trajectory of human civilization across the next 10,000 years. "The power to change the past exists," the Emperor acknowledged, "but only at costs that may prove higher than the benefits such change would purchase. To undo your survival would require sacrifices that extend beyond your own existence, rippling backward through time to affect every choice made since Horus's death. Your brothers who live, the innovations that have emerged, the victories that your visions made possible, all of it would be unmade to restore the canonical timeline." Sanguinius felt the weight of that understanding settle upon his shoulders like the burden of Atlas himself. To save humanity from the stagnation that his survival would eventually cause, he would need to erase not just his own continued existence, but every positive consequence that had flowed from his choice to live rather than die beautifully. Rogel Dawn's tactical innovations, Gilliman's administrative reforms, the countless battles won through prophetic foresight, all of it would be sacrificed to restore a timeline where suffering served as the foundation for strength. The Angel of Baal found himself confronting the ultimate philosophical question that had haunted prophets and visionaries since consciousness first glimpsed the future's shape. Did the knowledge of consequence create the obligation to act, even when that action demanded the destruction of everything one sought to protect? Was the right to alter fate a blessing or a curse, and did wisdom lie in the use of such power or in the restraint to leave destiny undisturbed? As he wrestled with these questions, Sanguinius became aware that his gene sons throughout the galaxy were experiencing similar moments of crisis, their enhanced psychic sensitivity allowing them to perceive fragments of their Primarch's internal struggle. Blood Angels across 100 worlds found themselves confronting visions of alternate timelines where they bore different curses but served greater purposes, where their suffering purchased victories that peace could never achieve. For the first time since his survival aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Sanguinius found himself truly understanding the burden that the Emperor had carried for millennia, the terrible weight of choices that determined the fate of species and civilizations. Yet unlike his father, who had accepted that responsibility as the price of his transcendence, Sanguinius discovered that knowledge, without the certainty of righteousness, was a burden that threatened to crush even his superhuman spirit. The chamber fell silent as father and son contemplated the magnitude of the choice that lay before them, each understanding that whatever decision emerged from this moment would echo across time itself. Outside the palace walls, across the galaxy that his survival had shaped, humanity continued its journey through the stars, unaware that their fate hung in the balance of an angel's doubt, and the question of whether any being, no matter how noble, possessed the right to determine the shape of eternity itself. In that silence, pregnant with the weight of 10,000 years of consequence, Sanguinius prepared to make the most difficult choice of his existence, knowing that whatever path he chose would be marked by the kind of sacrifice that no vision could fully prepare him to bear. The weight of eternity had settled upon his shoulders, and only his decision could determine whether humanity would face its future trials with the strength born of suffering, or the weakness that flowed from comfort with the divine. Chapter 11. The Last Flight of the Angel. The final battle for humanity's future began not with the thunder of guns or the screams of dying warriors, but with silence that stretched across the void like a held breath before the storm. Above the world of Baal Secundus, where the blood angels had gathered in numbers not seen since the Great Crusade, the umbral devourers manifested from the spaces between dimensions as entities that consumed not flesh, but the very concept of existence itself. Their forms were absence given shape, voids in reality that hurt to perceive directly. Yet Sanguinius looked upon them without flinching as he prepared to lead his sons in what might be their final battle as the beings they currently were. The Angel of Baal stood upon the command bridge of the Red Terra, his perfect form wreathed in psychic energies that blazed like captured starlight as he prepared to unleash the full scope of his prophetic abilities. No longer would he carefully parse individual visions or cautiously act upon fragments of possibility. The threat that faced humanity demanded nothing less than absolute commitment to the gift that his survival had purchased, regardless of the cost to his sanity or soul. "My sons," Sanguinius spoke, his voice carrying across every blood angel's vessel in the fleet through psychic resonance that transcended mere communication. "We face an enemy born from the echoes of our own choices, creatures drawn by the alterations we have made to destiny itself. Yet in confronting them, we have the opportunity to forge something new from the crucible of battle, to become what we were always meant to be, rather than what we feared we might become." The umbral devourers struck without warning, their assault bypassing physical defenses to attack the fundamental essence of what made the Imperial fleet real. Ships began to fade from existence as their crews were drained not of life, but of meaning, their purpose consumed until nothing remained but empty shells drifting through void that no longer remembered their names. Yet Sanguinius had foreseen this moment in visions that stretched back to his first glimpse of altered futures, and his preparations had extended beyond mere tactical dispositions. As the enemy's assault reached its peak, the angel unleashed prophetic sight that encompassed not individual timelines, but the entire spectrum of possibility that branched from this moment. His consciousness expanded beyond the confines of singular perception, experiencing simultaneously every potential outcome of the battle, every choice that could be made, every consequence that might flow from victory or defeat. The visions crashed over him like tsunamis of liquid possibility, each one demanding attention while threatening to shatter his sanity beneath the weight of infinite knowledge. Through this overwhelming torrent of foresight, Sanguinius guided the imperial fleet with precision that seemed supernatural even to beings who had witnessed the Emperor's own tactical brilliance. He saw exactly where each enemy vessel would materialize before it arrived, precisely when their reality-draining weapons would fire, exactly how each imperial ship should move to avoid annihilation while positioning for counterattack. The Red Terra danced through patterns of destruction that should have been impossible to predict, her captain following orders that anticipated enemy actions before they were conceived. Yet the effort required to maintain such comprehensive foresight began to exact a toll that extended far beyond mere physical exhaustion. Sanguinius felt his consciousness fragmenting as he experienced every possible version of himself across infinite timelines simultaneously. In some realities, he died nobly, as originally intended, his sacrifice inspiring his sons to transcendent nobility. In others, he survived, but descended into the very madness he had sought to prevent. In still others, he became something beyond either mortality or divinity, a being whose existence transcended the normal boundaries of life and death. The visions showed him futures where humanity triumphed through strength forged in suffering, timelines where they were consumed by complacency born of too much peace, realities where they transcended the need for either struggle or comfort to become something genuinely new among the stars. Each possibility blazed through his consciousness with equal weight and validity, forcing him to confront the terrible understanding that there were no truly right choices, only different forms of consequence that echoed across eternity. As the battle raged around him, with blood angel ships weaving impossible patterns through fields of unreality, while their weapons carved wounds in entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime, Sanguinius found himself approaching a threshold that few beings had ever faced. The overwhelming flood of prophetic knowledge threatened to either destroy his sanity completely or elevate his consciousness to a state that transcended individual identity entirely. In that moment of cosmic crisis, as infinite possibilities crashed through his awareness like waves breaking against the shores of consciousness itself, Sanguinius achieved perfect clarity. Not the clarity of knowing which choice was correct, but the understanding that righteousness lay not in choosing the best possible outcome, but in accepting responsibility for whatever outcome one's choices created. The weight of prophecy had taught him that wisdom came not from seeing all possible futures, but from having the courage to shape one specific future with full knowledge of its costs. The vision that blazed through his consciousness with transcendent certainty showed him a path that neither preserved his survival nor restored his canonical death, but transformed both into something greater than either could achieve alone. He saw himself accepting a role that would save humanity, not through preventing their trials, but by ensuring they faced those trials with guidance that extended beyond the normal boundaries of mortality. It would require sacrificing not his life, but his individual existence, becoming a psychic beacon that could illuminate the darkness of uncertainty while remaining forever apart from the warmth of connection that made existence meaningful. "Father," Sanguinius spoke across the void to the Emperor, who watched the battle from Terra with growing understanding of what his son was choosing. "I see the path now. Not death as originally intended, nor survival as I chose, but transformation into something that serves purposes greater than either alternative could accomplish." The Emperor's response came as a wave of psychic energy that carried all the love and anguish of a father watching his most beloved child choose a fate that would save countless others while condemning himself to eternal isolation. My son, what you contemplate is a burden that should not be borne by any single consciousness. There must be another way, some path that doesn't demand such sacrifice from you. But Sanguinius had moved beyond the point where paternal concern could dissuade him from necessity. The visions had shown him with perfect clarity that the path he was choosing would prevent the stagnation that his survival would ultimately cause, while avoiding the grimdark desperation that his canonical death would have necessitated. Humanity would face trials, yes, but they would do so with guidance that could adapt to circumstances beyond any single prophetic vision's ability to encompass. As the final phase of the battle began, with imperial forces pressing their advantage against umbral devourers whose reality-consuming abilities proved insufficient against tactics guided by omniscient foresight, Sanguinius prepared for the transformation that would define not just his own fate, but the trajectory of human civilization across the millennia to come. He turned to address his gene sons one final time, his perfect features radiating a serenity that spoke of decisions made and burdens accepted. "My beloved children," he said, his words reaching every blood angel throughout the fleet, "you have served with honor that transcends the limitations of flesh and gene seed alike. What I am about to become will free you from the curses that have defined our lineage, while providing guidance that extends beyond my individual ability to offer. Remember me not as the angel who died for inspiration or lived for guidance, but as the beacon who chose transformation so that you might forge your own paths among the stars." The psychic chrysalis began to form around Sanguinius as he released his hold on individual identity, allowing his consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries that separated self from cosmos. His perfect form became translucent, then luminous, as the transformation that would make him something between God and guardian spirit commenced. The process was visible not just to those present, but to every psychically sensitive being throughout the galaxy, as the death of Sanguinius the Primarch and the birth of Sanguinius the Eternal Guide sent ripples through the warp itself. Captain Dante of the Blood Angels, witnessing his Primarch's transformation from the bridge of the strike cruiser Blade of Vengeance, felt tears of liquid starlight flow down his perfect cheeks as he understood what was being sacrificed for their salvation. Yet even as grief threatened to overwhelm him, he also felt a presence settling over his consciousness like a mantle of protection, the psychic essence of his transformed father, beginning the eternal vigil that would guide the Blood Angels through whatever trials awaited them. The umbral devourers, faced with the birth of an entity whose existence transcended the normal categories that their reality-consuming abilities could affect, found themselves not destroyed, but simply relocated to dimensions where their hunger could be satisfied without threatening the continued existence of material reality. It was not victory in any conventional sense, but resolution that addressed the fundamental incompatibility between their nature and the cosmos they had entered. As the psychic chrysalis completed its work, what had once been Sanguinius emerged not as a physical being, but as a presence that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, capable of perceiving all possible futures while guiding humanity toward outcomes that balanced struggle with hope, trial with transcendence. He had become what the galaxy had always needed, but never possessed, a guardian whose wisdom was tempered by love rather than mere duty, whose guidance could adapt to circumstances that no single vision could anticipate. The angel's last flight had ended, not in death or life, but in transformation that would echo across time itself, ensuring that when humanity faced its darkest trials, they would do so with the knowledge that someone who understood the weight of choice watched over them from dimensions beyond the reach of fate itself. The Blood Angels would forge their own destiny now, free from genetic curses, but guided by love that transcended the boundaries of mortality. In the void above Behol Secundus, where the final battle had reshaped the very nature of possibility itself, starlight seemed to shine with new warmth, as if the cosmos itself had been touched by the presence of one who had chosen to become eternal guardian rather than noble martyr or surviving hero. The future stretched out before humanity, bright with possibility, not because their trials had been prevented, but because they would face them with guidance that no amount of suffering or comfort could corrupt. Sanguinius had found the path that honored both his survival and his intended sacrifice, becoming something greater than either, while ensuring that his choice would serve purposes that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of any single decision made in the crucible of desperate battle. Chapter 12. Blood and Stars Eternal. The transformation of Sanguinius sent ripples through the fabric of reality that reached every corner of the galaxy, touching the consciousness of every psychically sensitive being with the birth of something unprecedented in the cosmos. Where once the Angel of Baal had existed as a singular entity, bound by the limitations of flesh and mortality, his transcendence created a presence that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, watching over humanity with wisdom tempered by eternal love rather than mere duty. The Blood Angels felt the change most profoundly, their genetic bond to their Primarch evolving into something that resembled communion with a guardian spirit more than the simple loyalty of gene sons to their creator. In the years following what came to be known as the Angels' Ascension, the Blood Angels chapter underwent changes that transformed them into something the galaxy had never witnessed. No longer warriors prone to genetic madness, they became living conduits for their Primarch's eternal wisdom, their enhanced psychic abilities allowing them to serve as humanity's early warning system against threats, both material and spiritual. Captain Dante, who had wept tears of liquid starlight as he witnessed his father's transformation, found himself capable of perceiving danger across vast distances through dreams that carried the weight of prophetic truth. The chapter's librarians developed abilities that extended far beyond conventional psychic disciplines, becoming interpreters of visions that arrived through their connection to Sanguinius's transcendent consciousness. Brother Librarian Mephiston, freed from the multiple personality fragmentation that had threatened his sanity, discovered that he could channel different aspects of his Primarch's infinite perspective, accessing strategic insights that proved invaluable in campaigns across the galaxy. Yet this gift came with its own burden, as the Blood Angels found themselves experiencing fragments of their father's eternal vigil, sharing in the weight of watching over humanity's destiny across the span of centuries. The Emperor, witnessing how close he had come to losing another beloved son to the consequences of cosmic responsibility, reformed his approach to ruling humanity in ways that would echo across the millennia. Where once he had maintained distance from his subjects to preserve their capacity for independent growth, the near loss of Sanguinius taught him that some burdens were too great to be borne alone. The Master of Mankind began to share fragments of his vast knowledge with trusted servants, creating a network of guidance that could adapt to circumstances beyond any single consciousness's ability to anticipate. This change transformed the Imperium's development, along lines that diverged significantly from the canonical timeline. Rather than the grinding bureaucracy that would have emerged from 10,000 years of desperate survival, this version of human civilization grew into something more akin to a psychically awakened collective consciousness. Worlds maintained their individual cultures and customs, but they were bound together by subtle psychic links that allowed for coordination and mutual support on a scale that purely material communication could never achieve. The Adeptus Mechanicus, guided by visions that arrived through the Blood Angels' prophetic network, made technological advances that balanced innovation with wisdom rather than merely pursuing knowledge for its own sake. The Space Marine chapters developed tactics that incorporated psychic coordination as a fundamental element, their campaigns guided by strategic insights that seemed to anticipate enemy movements with supernatural accuracy. Even the Imperial Guard evolved into something more than mere cannon fodder. Their regiments trained to fight as part of a larger psychic collective that could adapt to battlefield conditions with remarkable flexibility. Yet as the centuries turned to millennia, it became clear that this transformed Imperium faced challenges that were fundamentally different from those of the canonical timeline. The psychic awakening that Sanguinius's transcendence had catalyzed made humanity more capable of facing certain threats, but it also made them more vulnerable to others. Chaos incursions that would have been contained by simple ignorance instead found purchase among populations whose enhanced sensitivity made them more susceptible to warp-based corruption. When the 41st millennium finally arrived, bringing with it the threats that Sanguinius's original visions had revealed, humanity faced them not with the grimdark desperation of the canonical timeline, but with a form of psychic unity that had never before existed in galactic history. The first Tyranid hive fleet to reach the galaxy's edge encountered not scattered human settlements fighting in isolation, but a coordinated response guided by prophetic foresight that had been preparing for their arrival for 10,000 years. The Great Devourer's advance became a different kind of conflict entirely, as the Tyranid's hive mind encountered human resistance that operated on similar principles of collective consciousness. Sanguinius's eternal presence served as a psychic lighthouse that prevented the alien intelligence from completely adapting to human tactical patterns, his transcendent perspective providing insights that remained perpetually one step ahead of the swarm's evolutionary responses. Yet even in victory, the cost became apparent. The Blood Angels who served as primary conduits for their Primarch's guidance began to experience a form of transcendence that gradually separated them from purely human concerns. Companies of the chapter reported brothers who spoke in voices that carried harmonics of their father's eternal wisdom, but seemed to forget the immediate needs of mortal existence. They became perfect warriors and flawless strategists, but the warmth of human connection that had once defined their nobility grew distant as they served as living extensions of Sanguinius's cosmic consciousness. The final confrontation with chaos took a form that neither the original timeline nor even Sanguinius's enhanced visions had fully anticipated. Rather than the desperate last stands of the canonical future, this conflict became a battle for the very nature of consciousness itself, as the ruinous powers sought to corrupt the psychic unity that humanity had achieved through their connection to the transcended angel. Sanguinius's role in this cosmic struggle was not as a warrior, but as a psychic anchor that prevented the collective human consciousness from being overwhelmed by chaos influence. His eternal presence served as a constant reminder of nobility and sacrifice, a beacon of hope that burned too brightly for the darkness of the warp to extinguish. Yet even this service came with costs that rippled through the dimensions he now inhabited, each act of protection requiring sacrifices of personal identity that left him increasingly distant from the individual consciousness he had once possessed. As the millennia passed, and threats emerged that even his transcendent vision had not fully foreseen, Sanguinius began to understand that he had not solved the fundamental problems of existence, but had merely exchanged one set of challenges for another. The suffering he had prevented through his transformation had been replaced by different forms of loss. The curses he had lifted from his sons replaced by burdens that were perhaps more bearable, but no less real. The galaxy that emerged from this altered timeline was neither the grimdark nightmare of the canonical future, nor the perfect utopia that his original visions had sought to create. Instead, it became something unprecedented, a cosmos where humanity possessed the psychic tools to face cosmic threats, but remained vulnerable to the very gifts that made such resistance possible. Worlds prospered under the guidance of collective wisdom, yet struggled with the loss of individual agency that such coordination sometimes demanded. The Blood Angels served as perfect guardians of human interests, but gradually became something beyond human understanding themselves. In the depths of dimensions that existed between material reality and pure thought, Sanguinius maintained his eternal vigil with a consciousness that encompassed perspectives no mortal mind could contain. He witnessed every birth and death among his gene sons, felt every moment of triumph and despair experienced by the humans he protected, perceived every threat that approached from the darkness between stars. Yet for all his transcendent awareness, the question that had driven his original choice remained unanswered: whether the path he had chosen truly served humanity's best interests, or had merely created a different form of the same eternal struggle. The Angel's perspective, stretched across 10,000 years of transformed history, allowed him to perceive patterns that spanned galactic cycles, to understand consequences that unfolded over time, scales that dwarfed individual lifespans. He saw how his choice had prevented certain forms of suffering while enabling others, how his transcendence had solved some problems while creating new ones, how every act of cosmic intervention carried costs that echoed across dimensions of existence that mortal consciousness could barely comprehend. As he watched over the Blood Angels who served as his living connection to material reality, Sanguinius felt something approaching peace settle over his transcendent awareness. He had not achieved perfection through his sacrifice, had not created a universe free from struggle or loss, had not prevented all the suffering that existence seemed to demand. Instead, he had ensured that when humanity faced its trials, they would do so with guidance that combined wisdom with love, strength with compassion, hope with the hard-won understanding that some battles could only be won by those willing to fight them. In the 41st millennium of this altered timeline, as new threats emerged from the void between galaxies and ancient enemies stirred from slumbers that had lasted since the galaxy's youth, humanity faced the future not with the desperate ignorance of the canonical timeline, but with eyes opened to possibilities that transcended the simple dichotomy of victory and defeat. They would struggle, as all living beings must struggle, but they would do so under the watchful gaze of one who had chosen eternal service over personal peace. The stars themselves seemed to shine with warmer light in this transformed cosmos, as if touched by the presence of an angel who had learned that the greatest sacrifice was not the giving of one's life, but the acceptance of existence without end in service to those whose lives remained beautifully, tragically finite. Sanguinius had become eternal, not to escape the burdens of choice, but to bear them across time itself, ensuring that future generations would face their trials with the benefit of wisdom earned through 10,000 years of watching, waiting, and loving without the possibility of rest. The blood of the angel flowed now not through mortal veins, but through the very fabric of space itself, binding humanity together in bonds that could stretch across the galaxy, while remaining strong enough to provide comfort to a single child afraid of the dark. And in that endless vigil, in that eternal watch, maintained between dimensions that had no names, Sanguinius had found not the peace he might have known in death, but the satisfaction of service that would echo across stars and centuries until the final darkness claimed even the memory of hope itself.